All right, let's get started. Can you all hear me? I speak a bit softly, so if you don't hear me as time goes on, please let me know. Okay, my name is Ritesh Mistry. I'm from the University of Michigan. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Health, Behavior, and Health Education, and I'm one of the investigators in this center called CASTOR. It's my pleasure to be here today, and I'm really pleased that you all registered for this workshop, and I hope that you're getting something valuable out of it. I know it's a lot of information and a lot of very complex statistical methods, but the idea for this workshop is to just give you guys all an introduction to these methodologies to see if you want to incorporate them into your own work somehow. Not that you become experts in these things. So my task today was to talk about this concept called latent variable analysis, specifically latent transition analysis. And Andrew, Dr. Brower, just before me, talked about this methodology of multi-state modeling, where you're modeling transitions of observed states, okay? And in this work, we'll talk about modeling what we call latent states, okay? And it's an introduction, and it's designed for non-statisticians, so I don't have any formulas or anything like that in my talk. I will be just describing conceptually what this methodology is all about, where it comes from, and talk a bit about its application to some tobacco control related research questions, okay? All right, just as a background into the methodology, latent transition analysis actually is an extension of latent class analysis. And I'm sure many of you have heard of this type of approach, but just to summarize what it is, it's a type of statistical mixture model used to identify probabilistic subgroups within a population, right? That are not directly observable from the data itself. Okay? For example, you know that sexes are more directly observable, race, ethnicity may be directly observable, but things like behaviors across multiple tobacco products are hard to directly observe. Things like attitudes, you know, about tobacco and its harms and its value are hard to directly observe. You usually observe those using multiple items. So latent class analysis takes these observed data and turns them into latent subgroups that we can try to describe the content of those subgroups and see and understand the prevalence of those subgroups. Okay? So latent class analysis is analogous to factor analysis, which probably many of you have heard of or used, where we may have a set of questions or items in a scale, and you develop a score or a factor from that set of items. But factor analysis is more variable centered, meaning that it focuses on the relationship between variables. Whereas latent class analysis is more person centered. You need to focus on which individuals that are in your study, how do they relate to each other based on their responses to a set of variables. Okay. Latent class analysis is used to reduce the dimensionality of data. It's a data reduction process, just like factor analysis is. But in latent class analysis, we're dealing with categorical variables as opposed to continuous variables. So again, the goal of latent class analysis is to identify what we call latent classes that represent the response pattern in the data that is observed, and then to provide a sense of prevalence of those latent classes. Just to kind of situate where latent class analysis falls within other latent variable approaches and models, we have on the left here, you see the cursor, indicators that are treated as continuous and indicators that are treated as categorical. So indicators here are the observed variables, right? You may, and then On the columns here, we have continuous latent variables and categorical latent variables. So when your indicator variables are continuous, you can use factor analysis to summarize that data into a continuous latent variable. Right? For example, you may have responses to a set of continuous variables that depict ratings on, let's say, level of dependence in a continuous form, and you summarize that into a single latent variable. You can also use latent profile analysis to turn a set of continuous indicator variables into a categorical variables that describes the profile across these set of latent variables. You may also have indicator variables that are categorical. In our example today, we're talking about tobacco use behavior. The frequency of tobacco use, for example, is many times measured as an ordinal categorical variable, right? And you can turn those ordinal categorical variables and summarize them into a continuous latent variable using things like latent trait analysis or latent item response theory. Or you can use a categorical, turn them into a categorical latent variable where latent class analysis falls. So these are all methodologies that create latent variables, but here we're focusing on just this one type of latent variable model for today. So just to give you a pictorial depiction of what I'm talking about, at the bottom, the X's represent the categorical indicator variables, okay? In the work we'll talk about in a little bit, it will be measures of tobacco use. And those variables are used to derive a latent variable, which is a categorical latent variable. And these lines denote what we call item response theory probabilities, meaning what percentage of each category of a latent variable is endorsing one of the categorical variables here. And you'll get a better idea what I mean as we work along. And these are the error terms associated with the measurement of the observed data. So the key parameters to think about when we think about latent class analysis are the prevalence of each latent class, or the probability of latent class membership, which is usually denoted by the Greek letter gamma, and item response probabilities, which is usually denoted by Greek letter rho. And that's the probability of a response to an item conditional on a membership of a latent class. These item response probabilities are the main basis for interpreting and labeling the latent classes. And so the assumptions in latent class analysis are that the observed variables are assumed independent within a latent class. But that does not mean that they are not correlated with each other in the full data set. So let's look at an example from the book that was assigned to you for reading today as a recommended book, Collins and Lanza, which talks about latent class and latent variable transition analysis. This is an analysis of the AdHealth data, longitudinal study of adolescent health, which started in the mid-90s, and I think maybe the last wave was completed in the late 2000s or so. So this is from wave one of the AdHealth data, and the idea here is to look at what is called delinquent behavior in these adolescents, and see if there are certain subgroups that could be identified by the response patterns in items that measure these delinquent behaviors, like lying to your parents, being rowdy or unruly, damaging property, stealing something from a store, stealing something worth $50 or less, and taking part in group fights. So as you can see, there's quite a variability in responding yes to any of these items, right? Anywhere from 57% of the sample saying that they lied to their parents, to 17% of the sample saying that they had damaged some property. When you do run a latent class analysis, it will generate classes for you based on the variables that you input in the data. So here, these are based on, what is it, 6 different items. And through the process of latent class analysis, 4 classes were identified. Okay, and one job of latent class analysis is to see if the actual classes that are formed are meaningful. Can you create meaningful labels for these classes? And if you're not able to do that as a researcher in your current field, then it's probably the latent class analysis is not helping you answer any type of research question. So in this case, we see that latent class 1, which is this light solid line, is pretty low on each of these variables, right? There's some reporting of lying in this class, maybe about 30%, and maybe about 20% reporting being rowdy. But otherwise, it's low on these other delinquent behaviors. Okay? And then we have another class 2, which is this dashed line, which is reporting a high level of lying and a high level of being rowdy, but less so in terms of these other delinquent behaviors. Class 3 is reporting a high level of lying, a somewhat rowdy, but there is a spike in shoplifting and theft, which is not reported in some of the other classes. And class 4 is delinquent along all of the different behaviors, right? So you get these are what we're calling the item response probabilities, this column. Okay, and these are the items themselves. Okay, and it's the and so each class is for each class you're given item response probabilities across each of the factors that are included in the model. So your task as a scientist would be to label these and see if those labels make any sense. So this is a tabular form of the data we just looked at in the chart. And Collins and Lanza labeled these classes as the first class being non or mild delinquents. The second class is labeled as verbal antagonists. The third class is labeled as shoplifters, and 4 is labeled at general delinquents. And these are the item response probabilities for each of these classes. And these are the items that were included in the latent class analysis. And here, this row tells you the probability of membership, meaning the prevalence of each of these latent classes at the time of the survey. So 49% of the sample was a non or mild delinquent, 26% were verbal antagonists, 18% were shoplifters, and 4% were general delinquents. Highlighted proportions here, probabilities here, are the ones that are more than 50% of the sample within each of these latent classes. So this is telling you that of those in the mild latent or non-delinquent latent class, 33% lied to their parents, 20% were publicly rowdy, 1% damaged property, 3% stole something, none stole something worth less than $50, and 4% were taking part in a group fight. Here, for the more extreme delinquent class, there are much higher probabilities of responding yes to each of these items. Now, what does latent transition analysis do? It takes the latent class analysis and applies it to longitudinal data. So it's a longitudinal extension of latent transition class analysis. So in latent class analysis, the class membership is static, meaning that you have only data collected at one time point. The classes don't, there's no movement amongst the classes in any way. Whereas in latent transition analysis, the classes are called quote unquote dynamic, meaning there is the possibility to analyze transitions from one class to the next, right? Over time, over the next time period. And Dr. Brower talked a little bit about what the value of estimating transitions is in tobacco control research, for example. It's also, for the example we just looked at now, what is, who are the kids who may transition from being non-delinquent to a class that is a general delinquent, right? So you can understand why that might be happening, which students might be experiencing that transition more than others. And just in terms of terminology, latent transition analysis is to model transition between latent states, or called statuses in many of the studies in the literature, from one time point to the next. Whereas in latent class analysis, the groups are called classes because they're not static. States are something has a connotation of something that could change, right? Or status is something that can change. So much of the literature, if you look at latent transition analysis, they'll be using the word status and sometimes states to denote the subgroups that are identified. And just to reiterate, how is this different from what was discussed in the previous session? In the previous session, you were analyzing transitions among observed states, right? You had to clearly define states beforehand before you can measure transitions amongst them. And that's an important activity when you're doing multi-state transition models. In this set of analyses, those states are defined probabilistically and through the latent class process, right? So we're looking at transitions among latent states. So let's just look at depiction of that as a picture. So this is the latent class kind of model here on the left at time 1. And if you have the same data at 2 time points, you can look at transition probabilities between the latent, the categories of the latent variable, okay? So you would have, in addition to the item response probabilities and the prevalence of each latent class category, you will also get a third parameter, which is the latent transition probability in latent states. Yeah.
All right, question. So for this type of approach, would you have to use only like longitudinal data like graph, or would you use like to examine cross-sectional trends? Looking at a cross-sectional survey at multiple time points, like, does it have to be longitudinal?
Good question. It has to be longitudinal because you're looking at a movement in class membership over time. So you want to see if an individual moves from one class to a different class over time. So it should be a cohort study data set. For the repeated cross-sectional designs, you would have to use latent class analysis to look at the classes at each cross-sectional time point. But you wouldn't be able to really look at transitions at all in that type of analysis. Okay, so the key parameters for latent transition analysis are similar to latent class analysis. You will get a gamma estimate, which is the probability of latent class membership. So that's the prevalence of each class at each time point. And you'll get item response probabilities, which are the probability of particular response on an item, conditional on membership in a particular latent state. And third, which is the transition probabilities themselves, generally denoted as tau, the probability of transitioning from one latent state to another. So now this is the same analysis we looked at earlier, but with 2 waves of data, okay? Wave 1 and 2 of the ad health study data. And here, so the latent class analysis was performed again and on a larger data set. And if you notice, we have one more status or class that has emerged after you have a fuller data, more data to really define and characterize a class. And what's basically happened is you have a class that where the low or none or a very minor delinquent behavior, that class was separated, and there was a group that was said yes to lying to their parents. So that group got separated when you added the wave 2 data. And I'll talk to you about what the procedure is to actually generate this type of results. And so here, these are the results from the previous chart, but some additional information. For example, here we have the probability of membership, which is the prevalence of the latent states or latent statuses at time 1 and at time 2. So these kids were in grade 10 and 11 in time 1, and then 11 and 12 in time 2. And then here are the conditional probabilities of an AS response, which are the item response probabilities for each latent status. So the non-delinquents, you can see, are endorsing almost all the delinquent behaviors at a very low rate, except for being publicly rowdy. There's 15% of that happening. So there's a label called liars. I don't like the labeling here, but it is what it is in this study. So this group, 72% said that they lied to their parents. 22% said they were publicly rowdy, and so forth. These are the verbal antagonists. 72% said they lied to their parents, and 89% said they were publicly rowdy. These are the shoplifters, quote unquote. So lying to the parents is pretty common almost across most of the latent classes or states. But this group also said yes to stealing from a store or stealing something worth $50 or less. And you have the general delinquent class or status. And these are the transition probabilities. I think one way to look at that is the same as the previous talk about the multi-state transition models. The diagonals are what we may call the stayers, okay, or the remainers, that they are remaining in their latent state. All the non-diagonal probabilities are the movers. So in this case, how would you read this? Sorry. So this is the time 1 data. That's so at time 1, 84% of non-delinquents remained non-delinquents at time 2. From time 1, 10% of non-delinquents transitioned to the quote unquote liars class. 3% transitions to verbal antagonists, 2 to shoplifters, and 1 to general delinquents. You can also see from this diagonal that, what's the most transient status, which is the shoplifter group. Only 34% remain in that group, and 26% move to being non-delinquents, 29% move to lying, 11% move to verbal antagonists. So some key steps on how to conduct latent transition analysis. The first thing you want to do is you want to examine the distribution of your variables, your indicator variables that are going to be inputted into the latent class analysis. If possible, if you don't have too many variables, you can look at the contingency table of the observed data, where you cross-tabulate the variables of interest. But you can imagine that table could get very large very quickly and become hard to analyze, and or make sense out of. And that's why you use approaches like latent class and latent transition analysis. And 2 is you examine the statistical and conceptual fit of LCA models with different numbers of classes at each of your time points. So basically, you're running latent class analyses for each time point, and you're running it for X number of latent classes. Okay? And the idea here is to look at the fit of the data at each time point for each number of latent classes. And you can assess fit by using information criterion like the AIC and BIC or the adjusted BIC. You can use a likelihood ratio test and entropy, which is a measure of uncertainty in class membership. The higher the entropy number, the more assurance you can have that the class membership is accurately depicting the observed data. The other thing you need to do is examine the item response probabilities of each latent class model at each time point, and examine the conceptual fit, meaning do the classes and their what constitutes the classes, does that make sense conceptually according to your research question? Okay, and so once you do that, if the latent classes appear to be stable over time, meaning that at each time point you're seeing that, okay, I'm seeing about 4 classes in time point 1 and in time point 2, 3, so on. The atom responsive probabilities are stable across these time points for each, for the class structure that's the best fit. You can say that, assign the model to have measurement invariance for item responsive probabilities. So you can constrain the item response probabilities to be consistent over time. And this is actually advised because if you don't do that, your class membership will be different at each time point, and then it'll be very hard to interpret what's happening in terms of transitions. Okay. And the other thing is if the transition probabilities appear to be stable over time, you can test the model for measurement invariance of transition probabilities. So you can, if you have 4 waves of data, you can tell the procedure to give you just one set of transition probabilities instead of transition probabilities for each step, meaning from wave 1 to wave 2, wave 2 to wave 3, and so on. And then once you do that, you can consider using LTA with covariates, meaning that you can examine what other factors may be associated with class membership, and 2, what factors might be associated with the transition probabilities themselves. So you can understand, are certain demographic groups more likely to belong in one latent state versus another? What are the characteristics of individuals that may transition from one group state to another? So you can do add covariates to latent transition analysis. But today I'm really just focusing on the first 4 steps here, and we're not talking about doing covariates in this work. So let's talk a little about why you may want to use latent transition analysis in tobacco control research. Why not just use observed states and go with that? Why do we want to use latent states? Well, one problem that's occurring for our center is we are in a tobacco marketplace where we have a multitude of tobacco products. And part of what we're trying to do is to understand, what are the patterns of use in the population across so many different tobacco products? In addition to that, what is the frequency and intensity of use of these products? And that's very hard to do if you wanted to have a multi-product perspective, especially in a situation where the number of products seems to be increasing over time, right? We have new products that will be coming into the market, heat not burn products, dissolvable products, and so forth. So part of what we want to do is to see, well, how do these products relate to each other? Are certain groups of people attracted to a certain poly-tobacco use behavior, whereas other groups might be using just a single product or dual products. So to do that, you can take a direct approach. You can just say, hey, I'm interested in studying cigarettes and ends use and dual use and looking at transitions among them, and I'm going to ignore the rest of the products in the marketplace. And that poses its problems because we don't know what's happening with other tobacco behavior when you just look at 2 or 3 products or 2 or 3 states, right? So LTA or LCA will help us understand meaningful subgroups of tobacco users in the population. across many different products and many different intensities of use. Right? In addition to that, you can also examine other factors to describe or develop your latent states or latent classes. You can not just look at behavior, but you also can look at issues around attitudes or intention. For example, intention to use could be added to the latent class model to generate classes that have intention information within them, or dependence, or social networks. So there's a wide variety of ways latent class and latent variables approaches have been used to characterize the populations into subgroups of tobacco users. Today, I'm just really focusing on multi-product tobacco use behavior as a way to drive the latent classes. But many researchers look at things like history of use, dependence, social networks, and things like that to actually generate the latent classes. I already mentioned this, reduce the complexity of the data, especially when you have many variables of interest. So we have, in the marketplace, maybe 10 different categories of tobacco products. That's hard to summarize if you're looking at frequency information on top of that. So LTA and LCA will help you reduce the complexity of those data. Estimate transition probabilities. We talked about earlier why it's important to look at transitions. People initiate tobacco use. So that's a transition behavior, right? People give up one tobacco product and maybe start another one. That's a switching behavior. So that could be analyzed. People stop using for a while. People relapse. So all those transitions are critical for understanding tobacco use behaviors in the population, especially for modeling. One thing that it also could do is to help us look at what observed groups should we be analyzing in future work. For example, there are many types of cigarette users, not just one type, right? And some of the latent class analysis work we've done identifies different types of tobacco users, cigarette users. And that may become important when you do modeling work. The other thing is estimate covariates of latent states and transition probabilities. So things like, if we're interested in things like issues of disparity, in terms of economic disparity or race ethnic disparity, you can see if certain races or certain SES groups are more likely to transition to initiation, to cessation, to relapse, and that type of thing. All right, so let's look at some examples in tobacco control as it relates to latent transition analysis and latent class analysis. So this is a paper, it's published in 2018. The title is Identifying Patterns of Tobacco Use Among US Middle School and High School Students, a Latent Class Analysis. The aim of this study was to identify using latent class analysis, heterogeneity and underlying subtypes of tobacco use based on 6 forms of tobacco products: cigarettes, cigars, chewing tobacco, pipes, e-cigarettes, and hookah, among middle and high school students in the United States. The secondary aim was to look at sociodemographic factors associated with the underlying subtypes of tobacco use. This is the basic latent class model used to inform this analysis. So you have those 6 different categories of tobacco products. This is the tobacco use latent class variable here. And they also did an analysis of sociodemographic, exposure to ads, access to tobacco, and so forth that may affect membership in a particular class. The data were NYTS data, National Youth Tobacco Survey data from 2013, and the indicator variables here were a 3-level ordinal variable of tobacco use: never use, lifetime use, but not in the last 30 days or past month, and then past month use. So when you do this type of work, you should run the latent class analysis across a set of different numbers of latent classes. So in this case, they ran the analysis with 1 class and up to 6 classes. The reason you do that is try to find the right number of classes for the data that you're working with, right? And the statistics that they're generally used for this type of work is to look at these information criteria, log likelihoods, entropy, and likelihood ratio tests. And as you notice, this is the text that describes a procedure by which they chose the latent class, the number of latent classes for their analysis. It's not quite I guess a science. It's a more of a bit subjective many times in making this decision. So as you notice, what they say is all information criteria decreased from 1 class to the 6 class model, meaning that the fit improved according to the information criteria as you added the number of classes. Entropy improved but leveled off at the 3 class solution. There's the entropy data. So this is perfect entropy, meaning class assignment was 100% related to the observed data. And as the number of classes go down, they bottom out at about 3 to 4 classes and then went back up. And because of likelihood ratio test and the problem of small sample sizes, when the number of classes went up, we considered the 3 and 4 class model. So what many times happens is when you look at high number of latent classes, the class size becomes very small and becomes unanalyzable, and there's not good class separation, meaning there are no meaningful classes that are generated. So what they did is, because of the performance of the ABIC in simulation and substantive interpretation, the 4 class model was chosen over the 3 class model, meaning that they believe that the 4 class model generated more meaningful classes than the 3 class model, and that's why they chose a 4 class model. So it's not just based on the measures of fit and measures of uncertainty. It's based on the size of the classes and the interpretability of the classes that it should be used to make a decision on the number of classes you will analyze in your work. So these are the classes, the 4 classes that they identified. The first class is a very low risk group, meaning there was very low tobacco use in the, so most of this chart is never use, right? There's some ever use, but there's no current use. Ever use of cigarettes, maybe some cigars, but very little use of anything else. This class is a class they had called lifetime smoking. So ever use is much more common in this latent class than current use. Most of it's around cigarettes and cigars. So they labeled this class lifetime smoking. The third class is lifetime multiple product use, meaning there was ever use of almost all the product to a high degree in this class. The final class here is past month multiple tobacco product users, where they're, about 60 to 70% are reporting cigarette and cigar use, and maybe around 40 to 25% or so are reporting chewing, pipe using, e-cig use, and hookah use. So in this way, you're able to take a large number of tobacco product classes or categories and reduce them down into a small number of latent groups. So this is some work we did with the path data. We were trying to understand the latent classes of tobacco use frequencies across multiple products in the US. So this was motivated by the fact that, we not just want to look at who uses and doesn't use, but how much people use and how does that inform the class structure. The aim was to identify latent classes of adults based on their use frequencies for multiple products and examine sociodemographic factors associated with the latent classes. So this is our basic latent class model. We have 9 different tobacco products, cigarettes, traditional cigars, filtered cigars, cigarillos, pipes, and so on. And we looked at path wave 3 adult data to do this analysis, and our indicator variables, our variables for each of these product use frequencies, was our 7-level ordinal variables, ranging from 0 days of use to 26 or more days of use. So if you can just imagine having 9 products with 7 levels in terms of frequency of use, and looking at the combination of all those, it's a huge contingency table with probably millions of cells. So we want to reduce that down into something that's interpretable, useful for the field. So this is the weighted prevalence of past 30-day use frequencies for the 9 different products. It just gives you an idea about the rate of use of each of these products and the frequency of use of these products. And you notice that cigarette use is most commonly used product in the population, of course. And much of it is almost the daily use. 14% of the whole sample reported 25 days or more use of cigarettes, right? But for the other products, it's almost a bimodal relationship. People endorse infrequent use, maybe 1 to 5 days of cigars, versus very low use in the middle ranges, and then it kind of goes back up to 20%, no, 0.2% for 25 days or above. So this just gives you an idea of the distribution of data. We have some sparseness of the data in the middle ranges here, 6 days to 25 days. And a lot of these variables are bimodal, which is okay for LCA and LTA. The only thing you need to worry about is not having enough data in the cells in your contingency table. Okay, so these are our fit statistics that we looked at. We looked at BIC, ABIC, which is an adjusted BIC for sample size, and the AIC and entropy. And you notice that the minimum for each of the information criteria is actually at 6 latent classes. And then it goes back up when you get to 7 latent classes, meaning the fit is best at 6 classes. And in terms of entropy, which gives you confidence in the class assignment, the bigger the number, the better. You see that it plateaus around 6 and 7 classes. So we were deciding between 5 and 6 latent classes. And the reason we chose 5 latent classes is because in the 6 latent class model, one of the classes was way too small. And we couldn't continue with our analysis of sociodemographic covariance. So we chose a 5-class model. And these are the estimated number of days each tobacco product was used for each latent class. And we derived these from the item response probabilities. So I'm not going to talk about how we derive those directly, but it's a quite simple procedure to generate actual frequencies from item response probabilities. And we use these number of days to actually label our classes. So our first class was the daily exclusive cigarette user class, right? They're using cigarettes on average 26 days out of 30 days a month. The second class, yeah. This one?
I see like there are different information criteria. What are the differences
How might I what?
How might you interpret the differences? You have PIC, APIC, AIC, all the three different. How would you interpret that?
Well, I think those information criteria usually go together in most of the data I've seen. I think the one to rely more on is the BIC and the adjusted BIC. And the adjusted BIC accounts for a sample size. So I think if you were going to put your money on one of these three information criteria, I would put it on ABIC. So I think that generally what you should do is look at all these different information criteria to see if they're kind of going in the same direction. Right? And what you're looking for is a minimum BIC that indicates a minimum information criteria, which indicates the best fit. All right, so the latent classes themselves. So the second group we called occasional cigarette users and poly tobacco users. Right, so we have a cigarette using group that also used less cigarettes than the daily group by about half, but also used infrequently almost all the other products. This is a poly tobacco use group with a higher level of cigarette using. So if you're looking at, let's say, an observed state model, and if you just had cigarette users in that model, you actually have two types of cigarette users, which you're just combining into one group, right? You have one that is a high intensity cigarette user, and the other one is a low intensity cigarette user who's using other products, which might be important for things like transitions, right? We actually, in the next analysis, when we look at transitions, this type of group, the poly tobacco use is less likely to quit or less likely to discontinue tobacco use than a daily cigarette user. So they tend to exhibit higher levels of dependence than do daily cigarette users. Sorry. So the third group, we had frequent e-product users and occasional cigarette users. So you see they're really endorsing two products, high level of e-cigarette use and somewhat low level of cigarette use. So these are dual users. They could be cigarette users who are trying e-cigarettes and maybe transitioning into e-cigarette use and giving up cigarettes. That might be happening. This fourth group are the daily smokeless tobacco users. They also use some cigarettes and snus pouches. The last group were the occasional cigar users. So here we also see that cigar users are broken up into two different classes, right? One group of cigar users, this group, class 2, are also using other products and heavily using cigarettes. Not heavily, but occasionally using cigarettes. Whereas this group is not using cigarettes at all, but using cigars and a little bit of e-cigarettes and smokeless tobacco products. So in this way, you can differentiate the product mix a bit more in a more nuanced way than you might in other types of analysis. So I guess right now, we're trying to model cigar use and its impact on health outcomes in the United States. And we are lumping all cigar users into one group in this modeling exercise, but it might be worth it to think about them as two different types of cigar users. One that are highly dependent, because we tend to see that dependencies seems to be higher in class 2, versus those who are less dependent and occasional users. This helps us kind of think about some of the limitations in some of the modeling that our group might be doing. Okay, so this is a paper that's in progress. It's a latent transition analysis of tobacco use frequency. So the previous paper was about a latent class analysis. We looked at wave 3 of path data. In this analysis, we're extending that analysis to look at waves 1 to 4 of path data to examine the latent states that emerge and to transition among states And 3, what sociodemographic factors are associated with latent states and the transition probabilities. So again, we looked at the same 9 tobacco products, but we reduced our indicator variable to be a 3-level indicator categorical variable. So non-current use, 1 to 5 days, 25 days of use, and 26 or more days of use. We only looked at tobacco users, ever tobacco users in this study. We didn't look at never users. So this is just a sample of ever established tobacco users to understand their profile of use and transition amongst states. So here's the frequency table for the different products. For wave 1, wave 2, wave 3, and wave 4. So again, gives you kind of a concept of how complex the data are when you look at so many different variables with a 3-level categorical variable. And again, you know, cigarette use is the most commonly used product at each wave. And the second most commonly used product are the traditional cigars at each wave. So selecting the right number of latent classes in this exercise or latent states, we did a cross-sectional LCA for each wave separately with varying number of latent classes from 3 to 9. So for each wave, we had 3. We ran 7 different models, LCA models. So we ran 28 different LCA models, right? And compared them all. We found that the latent class structure was more consistent when we looked at 6 or more latent classes. So we honed in on those latent classes. We did exploratory LT analysis of 3 to 9 latent states. And it showed that the information criteria values declined as we added more classes, and they plateaued at 6 or more classes, right? So 6 or more is probably the right number of classes to look at. And then we examined the composition of each latent state, each set of latent states, right? So when we looked at the LTA model with 6 latent states, it did not identify a non-daily cigarette use class, which was present in the 7 and 8 state models. The model with 8 states did distinguish 2 types of SLT users, but the exclusive SLT use state was so small, we decided that the 8-class model was not very useful. And so we ended up selecting a 7-class model or state model based on the information criteria, the conceptual properties of the latent states, especially as well as future computation we wanted to do, which was to analyze covariates of the states and transition probabilities. And to facilitate interpretation, we restricted the latent state composition and transition probabilities to be constant over the 4 waves. So these are again, the average number of days each product was used for each latent state. I guess one of the key exercises to doing this type of work is to label the latent states or latent classes to see if they make any sense, right? So maybe that's what you guys can do for the next, well, how much time do I have? 5 more minutes? Okay, so we'll skip that. So, you know, we had to label these latent states, and we did. So the first state was, again, similar to what we found in the latent class analysis. It was a daily cigarette use state, 29 out of the 30 days, but they also used e-cigarettes for 1 day. This is the daily cigarette and poly tobacco use state. Non-daily cigarette use state, which emerged, which was not there before in our LCA model with just wave 3 data. We have the daily e-cigarette and non-daily cigarette use state, the daily SLT use state, non-daily cigar use, and and then the non-current use state. Okay. So you can use these identity response probabilities to generate your to label your classes or your states. And these are the prevalence rates for each of the latent states across the 4 waves of data. The most common being daily cigarette use, and it remains pretty consistent over the 4 waves. Daily cigarette and poly tobacco use tend to go down over the 4 waves, which is consistent with other literature that poly tobacco use prevalence seems to be going down over time. Non-daily cigarette use almost remains the same. Daily e-product use and non-daily cigarette use seems to be going up a little bit, and so on. So this is the transition matrix that's generated as part of this analysis. So here are the previous wave latent states, and the rows are, and the columns are the later wave latent states. Okay, so diagonals show remaining in the same latent state from time 1 to time 2. And you can see here that this is the lowest number, meaning that the second latent state, the daily cigarette and non-daily poly tobacco use state, is the most transient. Most of those individuals who do transition to a daily cigarette use state. You also notice that for that group, only 0.3% transition to non-current use state, meaning a discontinuation of use. And the highest number here is that the non-current use diagonal number here, which indicates that 98.8% of non-current users remain non-current users, that they don't relapse really. And when they do relapse, they relapse into this non-daily cigarette use state. And let's see. The other thing to notice is the non-daily cigarette users, they're very likely to transition to non-current use. So maybe this non-daily cigarette use state is a transition to discontinuation in some way. And some of them move into this this daily cigarette use state. So here you can understand a bit about switching products, transitioning to a discontinuation use states, or increasing or decreasing the frequency of use, and so forth over time. I'll skip this example and just move on to the end. Just to summarize, okay, LCA, or latent class analysis, is a type of latent variable model that's used to identify probabilistic subgroups from a set of categorical observed data. LCA is used to substantially reduce dimensionality of data. In the examples I provided, I think we had a large number of combinations that were possible that we reduced down into something that's more digestible. LTA is a longitudinal extension of LCA. And LTA allows you to model the prevalence of, the composition of, and transitions between latent states. The key parameters that you want to think about when you look at LTA results are to look at the probability of latent state membership, the gamma, item response probabilities, rho, and transition probabilities, tau. There are many uses to LTA. I think in this talk, I focused mainly on multi-product use, but you can look at other variables in addition to product use. You can look at issues of dependence, intention to quit or initiate, many different things to develop the latent states themselves, and then look at transitions among them. The other thing is LTA, we didn't cover this much at all, I just brought it up. You can do LTA with covariates. You can understand which factors are associated with state membership or class membership, and which covariates might be associated with specific transitions. And there's also something called multi-group LTA, where you can stratify the LTA analysis into multiple groups. You may be interested in boys versus girls or men versus women. You may be interested in certain age groups because use patterns may be very different by age, right? Or certain cohorts and so forth. So there's a lot of potential. In terms of some resources, there is a nice resource at Penn State University. It provides an introduction to LTA. So I provide you a link to that. There's a SAS PROC LCA and PROC LTA user guide, which is very, very useful, which you should read if you're interested in this type of work. LTA analysis, I don't think there is a procedure in Stata, but there is a Stata plugin provided by the same group, the Methodology Center at Penn State University, for a Stata plugin to do LCA analysis. And you can also do this type of work in M+. So these are some resources for you to look at. The user guides are very helpful for understanding the inner workings of the analysis and the methodology. And here's the references for today's talk. And I think the primary one is the first one, which is a textbook on using LCA and latent transition analysis. Thank you.